For player profiles, in-depth features, and exclusive interviews, visit sfhandbook.com to learn more about the best young football players in the world. Hello everybody, welcome back to the Scouted Football Podcast with me, Joe Donoghue. From all of us at Scouted, we hope you've enjoyed the recent features, books, podcast episodes and website pieces we've shared with you since the beginning of this season. We're delighted with the feedback and would ask if you're particularly fond of this podcast or a particular episode to leave us a review on whichever streaming platform you use, whether that's Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, etc. If you're feeling extra generous, do check out our Patreon, where there have been plenty of exclusive pieces and the new Scouted Football Unfiltered podcast. Today, though, another guest, another expert, somebody who's very well versed on the topic of Scots abroad, mainly because he is one. Byron Hutchison hails from Dunfermline, if I'm not mistaken, but currently resides in the German city of Cologne. He works for the Bundesliga, runs the Football from Afar blog, and has also dabbled in football data and recruitment work, as well as contributing to the upcoming edition of the Scouted Football Handbook. Byron, thank you very much for your time. How are things?
Hi, mate. I'm good. Thanks for having me on. How are you?
Yeah, not bad at all. Really looking forward to getting into this topic today because I feel like there's often quite a lot of discussion around English players abroad, but there are quite a few honourable mentions as we'll get to, and quite a few players to discuss, including those under the age of 23 who are Scottish, and I think it deserves to have a bit of a light shone on it, and that's not just because we've got a very big listenership in Scotland either.
Yeah, no, it's a nice little niche, and I think particularly for Scotland, um, it, it's something that's a bit rarer than you might see from English players. There's obviously a bigger pool of talent in England, and you have quite a few guys going abroad and playing at quite a high level. When you think of Sancho or Tammy Abraham and things like that. But for Scotland, it's a bit rarer. We have a bit of a good history of players going abroad. When you think of Graham Souness or Steve Archibald at Barcelona and things like that, we've had players at a high level, but it doesn't always happen. It doesn't happen too often. So even now, the list is limited to about 20 in total, I think. But yeah.
Before we start, I'd like to get to know you a little bit better, and for people to get to know you a little bit better. Obviously, I mentioned the football data and recruitment work, working for the Bundesliga, football from afar. What's sort of a brief rundown of your footballing experience?
Yes, it's actually quite a lot. I think my girlfriend would probably tell you that I watch too much football, spend too much time thinking and writing about football, and then obviously do it for a living for the Bundesliga. So I work for the Bundesliga in social media and marketing. I'm sort of responsible for almost everything that goes out aside from our Chinese content. But even that still falls within my remit somehow. I've been doing that for about 3 years or just over 3 years now. Work and live in Cologne, like you said, and have been here for, well, I guess technically 3 years, although the pandemic meant I was back and forth between home in Scotland, Dunfermline, as you rightly say, and Cologne. And then beyond that, I've also began to the football from afar stuff and the data work and the recruitment work kind of coincided with each other in the last couple of years. So recently, I've done some work with a couple of clubs in Scotland in the Scottish Premiership, some slightly lower down, and some stuff for EFL clubs too, and dabbled a little bit with a couple of German clubs in terms of helping them shape the recruitment, doing some scout reports, that sort of thing. And then football from afar came around as really a bit of a hobby, but a way for me to get my voice out there as a Bundesliga employee. It's not always, or a DFL employee, it's not always easy to be open and honest with your footballing opinion. And I obviously felt like I had plenty to say about football and needed somewhere to sort of channel that energy. And I've always had an interest in the players playing abroad. And like you say, I'm a Scottish person. I was going to say a Scottish player there, a Scottish person that's moved abroad myself. It's always been a topic that's interested me. I've always found it a little bit romantic. So eventually, after being pushed by a colleague at the Bundesliga, actually Stuart Telford, who's in charge of the English website Bundesliga.com, to start the blog and do it, I took the dive and started doing some reporting on the players, and particularly on my Twitter, doing match reports and covering them quite extensively.
I'm fairly sure that if anybody does already follow you on Twitter, they'll be familiar with your match reports on games and players which do concern Scottish players abroad, and that's obviously the main topic of this podcast. But one thing I do have to ask, again, going back to Twitter, your profile picture on Twitter, or your display picture, is yourself next to Thomas Müller. Is he as jovial and as jokey a character as we've come to believe?
Thomas Müller's a very funny man, I would say. He's obviously, what I would say about the Bayern Munich players in general is they're all extremely professional, as you would perhaps imagine a football club to be. But at Bayern Munich, the standards are even higher. Um, so he's generally in a very good mood, but he definitely can switch it on when the camera comes on too. He's a very good showman. But yeah, in general, I'd say he's a very happy chap, and he's usually quite happy to oblige you and have some fun in front of a camera. So he doesn't disappoint.
That makes me very, very happy, because obviously, it's, you hear the whole "don't meet your heroes" shtick, and you like to think that people are exactly the same off camera as they are on camera. So that's quite reassuring.
So maybe to bring you down a little bit, for some players, I would say that's certainly true.
Oh yeah.
But Thomas Müller, I would say, is an exception. He's a good guy on and off the camera.
Lovely stuff. Anyway, let's get into the main section of this podcast, and that is, of course, Scottish players abroad. And I think I don't want to attribute this player as your favourite of the Scots abroad at the moment, but he is the player who I do see most frequently on your timeline. And you're probably going to correct me on the pronunciation of his surname, because it's Ewan Urain. Who plays for Athletic Club's B team, or Bilbao Athletic, who's a 21-year-old striker, stands at 6'3" tall, and he qualifies as a Scottish player, a Scot abroad rather, because he has a Scottish mother. But it's a curious one, isn't it? Because of Athletic Club's background being that only Basque-born players, only players with Basque heritage can represent the club. So it's quite a mishmash of nationalities there, isn't it?
Yeah, you're right to say that Urain. I think your pronunciation was better than mine, to be honest, mate. But that Urain's probably one of my favourite. I think mostly because he's very interesting because of the background, because he was Spanish born. I believe he was born in a town called Durango, if I'm not mistaken, in the Basque country. His father's obviously Basque as well, so he qualifies for Athletic Club through that, and then obviously for Scotland via his mother. But I think he was one that was on my radar actually for a little while, but I didn't have any confirmation of his connection to Scotland. I just knew he was somehow connected. And then I think the first place I actually saw it confirmed was via David Cartledge on Twitter, when Ewan started trained a little bit last summer with the Athletic Club first team. So credit to David for actually confirming that it was via his mother that he was connected to Scotland, because I actually hadn't confirmed it. I just had a suspicion before that. But yeah, he's been at Athletic Club for a little while now, for I think 4 or 5 years. And it also played for I actually forget the name of it, but I guess their reserve team, or their youth team that are somewhat affiliated with them for a season or two before moving to Athletic Club 2 proper.
Yeah, he's a player who has an absolutely fantastic accent, because he's been called up to the Scotland under-21 group in recent months, and you'll have to confirm whether he's been called up for the most recent international break, Byron, because I haven't done my research on that. I'm at pains to say.
No, so I can confirm for you that he was actually left out of the most recent squad. So he was in the squad before, travelled to Turkey with the team, but he didn't actually play, and then has been left out this time. I know that the under-21 management team were in touch with him and sort of said, you're still very much within the scope of being called up again, but we want to take a look at a couple of different players. And I think there was a few forwards that got called up that were being called up for the first time this time around. So that kind of speaks to that, and I think they're just exploring all of their options.
Yeah, I think with it being a new under-21 cycle, that definitely tallies and makes sense, I think. And as I was saying, he has a fantastic accent. And for those of you who haven't heard it, he did do a little piece to camera when he joined up to the Scotland squad. So I'm just going to play that for you now.
I got a call from Scott, and he asked me if I was eligible and if I would come. I told him I would be delighted to come here, and he contacts keep going on, and I'm here playing for Scotland. It's very special for me and for my family. So yeah, my mother, she misses Scotland, and I make her proud like this.
But as well as the fantastic accent, Ewan Urain, that's very difficult to say.
It's tough. Just call him Ewan. It's fine.
Ewan, which is so much easier. He has also trained with the athletic first team as well, I believe, hasn't he, Byron?
Yeah, so as I said last summer, he was called up during pre-season to train with the first team, and I think he's trained a little bit with them this summer as well, although he struggled with injury over the last couple of years. So I do know at the start of the season they were taking things quite slowly with him. But he's a promising talent, and obviously, as we discussed with the Basque region and the rule that Athletic Club put in place in terms of who they have in their squad, they're quite hopeful, I think, that he will be able to make a breakthrough. He recently signed an extended contract, I think, until 2024.
That's
So
always a good indicator, isn't it?
Yeah, it shows they have some faith in him, I think, and he's developed really well. I think if you look at his actual stats and the data, despite the injuries, he's always had very good output. Despite the limited minutes, he's always making an impact in games. Like you say, he's 6'3". He's a bit of a target man character, I guess. If I were to sort of define him by an archetype that might be easier to understand, he's a bit of a Giroud sort of character in that his link-up play is pretty good, but he's also got a very good eye for goal in the box. His movement in the box is really quite good. Don't want to oversell it. He's 21. He's still playing for the second team, so it's not. I don't want to make it seem like he's the next Olivier Giroud, but in terms of the type of player that he is, he kind of fits that mold a little bit, links up really well. It's good with his back to goal, and then in the box, his movement's very good. He tends to score scrappy goals rather than beautiful goals, which, in fairness to Giroud, over the course of his career, scored a few crackers, but he tends to be the guy hoovering up things at the end. He'll be at the back post, the kind of right place, right time kind of guy in the box.
Well, I suppose if there's going to be any sort of motivation, or whether people can say, oh, well, I was ahead of the curve on this one. Lyndon Dykes was only playing for Surfers Paradise Apollo in Australia when he was 21. So, he's currently a Scottish international. So we might see Ewan in future, maybe pulling on the jersey. But moving on to a player with a name which is a lot easier to pronounce. It's Aaron Hickey, who is a 19-year-old left back at Bologna in Serie A. And in terms of how regularly he's playing for his club side, he's probably the most, I don't want to say experienced, because obviously he is younger than many of the others in this list, but he's playing at the highest level repeatedly this season. I think that's fair to say. But a little bit of a background on him. He left Hearts, obviously one of the biggest Edinburgh clubs, as a youngster. Took a bit of a big leap of faith, really, and it's paid off. He's entrusted with that spot in the Bologna team. Starts regularly. From what I've seen, seems to be quite an adept ball carrier. But there are, as with many 19-year-olds, there are little nicks to his game, maybe areas to improve. But I mean, at 19 years old, there's not too much to be rushing him, fast tracking him to the senior setup at the moment, is there?
No, I think you're right though, that the move he made really paid off. So Hickey was quite sought after when he was muted to be leaving Hearts, and he received interest, I believe, from Lyon, but also pretty significant interest from Bayern Munich, who invited him over. He did a tour of the campus, saw everything there, so there was real interest there. And in the end, he decided to go for Bologna, and as you say, he's now in a starting role at 19. So it's pretty safe to say he wouldn't be in that role ahead of Alphonso Davies at the moment. So he's made the right choice there in terms of his development, and come along really well. Also should mention, I believe Owen Brown did a piece for the Handbook a few years ago, or a few seasons ago, on Aaron Hickey, so worth reading that too. But yeah, he's doing really well at Bologna. I think Hickey's an interesting one, like you say. He's probably got the most interest and got people the most excited in Scotland in terms of the players that are currently playing abroad, because of his age, because of the level he's playing at. The thing I would like to caveat, and I don't want to bring up sort of football Twitter too much, is that a lot of the things you can see on Twitter tend to be quite hyperbolic, and I feel like they're from people that haven't necessarily watched him a whole lot. So I agree with you that while the fact that he's so young, the fact that he's playing at that level, those are all positives, and I also don't want to sound like I'm putting the player down, because I think Hickey's a very interesting talent, and he could become a very good player for Scotland. But there are, like you say, areas of his game where he's struggling a little bit. I think the things you mentioned, he's a solid dribbler. His range of passing is really nice. I think in the final third and breaking the lines, when he's sort of advancing from that left back position, he's very good. He's decent with both feet. I think, again, I say decent because it's an area that I think is slightly overplayed by some people on Twitter. There's a lot of talk of his two-footedness. And while he's more than capable with his right foot, he's not Santi Cazorla. You're not confused as to which foot he uses primarily. He's definitely left-footed. He's definitely a left-sided player. I mean, maybe just some context for you, Joe, that there's a lot of calls for him to be playing right back for Scotland because
I've seen those,
yeah, because he played right back 4 times for Hearts, I think, when he was 17.
And I think there's probably a shade of the Stephen O'Donnell discourse in there, maybe mixed in a little bit.
Totally. Yeah, you're totally right. And it's also, like I say, it's also that he's playing at a good level and he's a young player. So people are... This is another thing that's true of sort of Scottish football in general. When one of our players leave, whether it's Aaron Hickey, whether it's Ryan Gauld or whoever else, when they leave and go abroad, people are... The fans of their previous club are very keen to see them do well. So Hearts fans are all in on Hickey. They really want him to be the next superstar out there. But yeah, as I was saying, I think there's a lot of good points to his game. But the things I think he struggles with are the physicality of the game at the moment. And it's one area of his game that kind of concerns me quite a bit, because you don't want to put a ceiling on someone's ability when they're 19, but I'm not so sure that he's ever going to be that sort of top tier athlete that you see playing wing back in the top 5 leagues, an Akraf Hakimi or a Denzel Dumfries or something like that. He's not going to reach that kind of level physically, which is a bit of a worry for me. I also think he struggles a little bit in defensive transitions, but I would also point to Bologna's lack of organisation generally in that area for perhaps a reason for that. And then going forward, again, this is another thing where I think he's probably a lot more capable offensively than he's shown. He has some good movement. He likes to move infield a little bit. He picks up good positions in half spaces and things like that. And like I say, his range of passing with both feet is really good. So when he gets into those areas, he tends to pick a good ball out. But at the moment, he's not really doing that too often. And just from my observations, I get the sense that Mihailovic, the manager, is kind of limiting his role at the moment and kind of easing him into things. I do get the sense that the players around him are sometimes reluctant to give the ball to him in the final third, and he's often kind of on the periphery a little bit. But like I say, that could be a systematic decision where they're sort of saying, okay, let's play down the right, or let's give it to the sort of more senior players and let Aaron just focus on keeping things tight at the back at the moment. But in general, he's obviously a very good player, and I think he's a good talent. And I think for me, rather than a right back, if he ever were to move position from left back, it would be into that sort of pivot area, into defensive midfield or maybe a central midfield area, like I say, where his range of passing can really be a huge asset, and he has to worry slightly less about the physicality of running up and down the left side for 90 minutes against some of the top athletes in the world who tend to be playing on the wing, those more physical, quicker guys. But yeah, he's a very exciting player and someone that Scotland fans should definitely be keeping a keen eye on, I think, over the next couple of years.
It's an interesting one, that, because I hadn't considered explicitly sort of, maybe merging him into that sort of defensive midfield role or that sort of pivot role, and number 6 sort of at the base of midfield, where, as you rightly say, the physicality element of it maybe is less pressing than going up and down the flank, going shoulder to shoulder with wingers, and having to hold your own going down the byline and being moved inside. I think it's his passing range again is one of the things which, aside from his ball carrying, is probably the second thing that you'd mention about Aaron Hickey, as you said. So yeah, it's one which I hadn't really considered, and I suppose it's interesting with the backdrop of the Scottish national team as well, because I'm sure everybody's been listening to this and gone, well, 19-year-old Scottish left back playing regularly in a Serie A side, but he's a left back, and there
Yeah.
does just so happen to be Andy Robertson. Kieran Tierney obviously plays left-sided centre half, but there does seem to be a good spread of Scottish fullbacks. Josh Doig as well, obviously coming through at Hibs. So I suppose that maybe having that malleability or the positional flexibility could in future be quite useful from Steve Clarke's perspective only. But yeah, it's one which I hadn't really considered. But I suppose if you've got that in your arsenal, then yeah, it can kind of make one place in your international squad effectively cover two positions. I think that's quite beneficial. And as you say, at 19, he's still got a lot of growing to do. He's still got a lot of maturing to do. There's still time to sort of mold him into a different type of player. So, yeah, I'm keen and I'm curious to see what happens with him over the next few seasons. But to this point, you can't really fault the experience that he's got and whether that move has paid off.
No, totally. And I think, the two things you mentioned there. So one, his malleability speaks to his technical ability. He is a good technical player, and I don't want to sound like I've downplayed that. And I think the other thing is, with him playing so regularly, it shows that people at Bologna have faith in him, and that there's an expectation that he will continue to develop, and he already is a first team regular for him for Mihailovic and for Bologna. I think the way they played it was that last season was a bit of an internship for him, working behind Mitchell Dykes. But as anyone who's followed Bologna will know, Mitchell Dykes isn't the most reliable in terms of his fitness. So Hickey ended up playing a little bit more. But I think the plan was always that he would come in and start regularly this season, and he has done. And what I would say is that he's generally played quite well. I don't want to overplay it, because there's been games where he's been poor, particularly against Inter Milan. He struggled against Inter Milan last season as well. But in general, he hasn't stood out as being either outstanding or terrible, which for a 19-year-old at that level is actually very good. And that's the thing I would kind of encourage people to take away from it. It's not so much that he's blowing people away with his talent, and it's not that I'm saying he's terrible. It's that he's doing just fine, which for someone his age is great. When you look at someone like Jude Bellingham as well at Borussia Dortmund, just for example, for me, Bellingham's a very good player, and I know a lot of England fans are excited about him. A lot of people around the Bundesliga are excited about him. For me, the thing that stands out is that this season more so, he's had some exceptional games, but last season he was playing well, but nothing he was doing was spectacular in a sort of middling Dortmund team. But the fact that he's so young and holding his own at that level in itself is a big deal. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely. Very much like remaining on that even keel is actually quite difficult to do at top level professional football, because you can have those games where you're spectacular, you come off the bench and you score 2 goals and it's just I can't believe that's just happened, whereas then you will not get an appearance for the next 3 months when you're that age, because you can't be trusted. The reliability factor isn't there, but clearly he's shown enough in training, and I like the Bellingham example.
He's shown that just recently. So that Inter Milan game I mentioned where they lost 6-1, Hickey was substituted at halftime. It was a really bad time for him. He came back the next game, scored his first Serie A goal, had probably his best outing that he's had since moving to Bologna, and I think that speaks a lot to his not only to the faith that Mihailovic has in him to continue playing him, but also that his character to bounce back from that and really give it his all the next game and put in his best performance so far for them. So I think everything you said there is bang on. Okay,
so I feel quite bad that I haven't got you to discuss a Scottish player, or in this case, 2 Scottish players who are in Germany at the moment, given your current circumstances. But they're not in the first team, and they probably haven't encountered Thomas Müller too often, but there are currently 2 young Scottish players playing for FC Bayern München's under-19s, and they are Liam Morrison and Barry Hepburn, who I think are fantastically named. You're not going to mistake them on the team sheet for being Scottish, are you? But both left Celtic sort of a year apart. But aside from that, I don't really know a great deal about either of these players, because of, obviously I saw when they moved, and obviously that was raised to my attention because it was, it's an unconventional switch. But aside from that, I haven't really been my day-to-day has not revolved around their development at Bayern, put it that way.
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, mate. Yeah, so they both moved over a year apart, like you said. I think through the same agent. I think is the reason that actually happened. And they've both been progressing quite well. It's obviously been a difficult time to be a youth player in any club with COVID going on, and in Germany in particular, it curtailed the seasons of the under 17s and the under 19s. Both last year and the year before, I think. So in terms of their on-field development, I think it's been a little bit tough. But as you say, this season they're both part of the under-19 squad, and a nice little fact is that the second most common nationality in the Bayern Munich under-19 squad is actually Scottish this season, which I think must be a first. That is excluding one or two players who have Kosovoan descent but have opted to play for Germany. But we'll take it. Next time you're in the pub, you can pop that little fact nugget out. But yeah, I think they're both progressing really quite well. Morrison in particular has been more around the under-19s this season than Hepburn, but they're both very much part of the setup. Neither of them are currently kind of regulars with the under-19s, which is obviously always going to be tough. The under-19s at Bayern Munich are very strong and very good, and there's guys there like Ibrahimovic. I've forgotten his first name, but he's a 16-year-old winger. He's clearly very good. He's playing for the 19s at that age, and in a similar position to Barry Hepburn. And they obviously see Ibrahimovic as someone that's going to break into the first team in the future, and perhaps Hepburn's a step behind him. But he's also still only 17. He's still progressing really well. He's still spending time around the under-19s. He's still very much part of the squad. So for the pair of them, like you say, it's hard to give a true proper update because they've not played too much over the last 2 years just because of the circumstances. But I know they're both enjoying their time out there. I know they're both adapting quite well. They're both quite integrated with their teammates, which is always I was going to say a really big deal, but probably the most important thing about anyone moving abroad, and particularly a young player, is that integration and making sure that they can communicate, have fun, spend time with their teammates, and kind of get to know them, because it can be very isolating if you move to a different country and everyone's speaking a different language and you don't know it. Particularly, I think at that age when you're so young, and you're presumably still having to do some of your schooling alongside these guys and everything like that. I think they've both adapted really well to that side of moving over. The football side, I think they're doing well, and it will come, and hopefully Liam Morrison in particular can start to break into the under-19s and play a bit more regularly than he has so far. For Hepburn, I don't think it's as vital. He's getting good game time. They obviously play other games behind closed doors and things like that, and I've seen footage of him recently doing some wild things in training. He's obviously still a big prospect for them, and hopes are high.
Definitely. I mean, it's encouraging to hear because, hearing anything about young Scottish players going abroad and actually assimilating well to whether it's the culture or whether it's their teammates or actually just getting minutes on the pitch. If you can get an amalgamation of the three, and I think that's as close as you can get to sort of, being a surefire recipe for success, I think. So yeah, I'm quite encouraged by that.
Yeah, I think as well. I mean, the thing to remember, I'm obviously saying that Morrison's not playing at the moment. He's captain Scotland at various age groups and things like that. But the reality of it is that most players at Bayern don't necessarily make it to the first team, or most just don't make it to the first team. But I don't think there's a much better finishing school for a player to be at. It's a perfect environment to train at the elite level. And like I said in the intro when we were talking about Thomas Muller, as a club, they're far and away the most professional, the most structured in Germany. I know for Morrison, for example, one of the reasons he moved over was that there was a pathway to the first team, and they do that with all of their youth players. They lay out goals, and there's a strategy and a real plan behind laid out for each of them, so that they have clear milestones that they can meet to continue to progress in their young career, and that, like I say, might not end up in eventually getting to first team football, but it should set them up well for the future.
Definitely. I agree with that. Moving on to sort of a little bit of a different segment on the Scouted Football Podcast, and it is still on the theme of Scots abroad. Do not fret. But it's the over 23s, because while there are not an awful lot of Scots abroad, there are some who have been, I hate using the term, but football manager wonderkids at one time or another. And I think you probably know which avenue I'm going down here, Byron, because Ryan Gauld, who you mentioned earlier, He has been. I mean, he's such an interesting case, isn't he? That the fact that he had obviously the breakthrough at Dundee United, and then went to Sporting Lisbon. Then went to Sporting Club de Portugal and has spent time at Firenze and now finds himself in Major League Soccer in the United States. His is a very off the beaten track career path for a Scottish for a Scottish footballer. I nearly said Scottish international there, and that's obviously a bone of contention, isn't it? But yeah, I mean, what is sort of the rundown of his story?
Yeah, so as you say, I'm very familiar with Ryan's story and wrote about it for the Scouted Football Handbook. Very proud to have done that, by the way. So thanks to you and the guys for inviting me to do so. Yeah, so he's got a really interesting story, like you say, and I think he's a bit of a different character from what you normally expect from a Scottish footballer or a British footballer. He's always had in his mind that he would play abroad since he was a young kid. I think he was very keen to play in Spain, for example. Like you say, he made the move to Sporting, and to keep it short, it didn't quite work out, I think, as he had planned. And there's a myriad of factors that go into that, and you can read about that in the handbook. But it didn't quite work out as expected. But I think the thing that he deserves credit for is really sticking out in Portugal. He adapted and assimilated, like you mentioned, with Morrison and Hepburn, probably more so than any other Scottish player I've seen, in that he learned the language really quite quickly. He enjoyed the lifestyle. He got familiar with the country as a whole, and was keen to stay out there and make it work. And he made that move to Firenze, and really, I think it's a good example of a player developing when they've been given game time, which is super important. He had really barely played much football or much consistent football at all in Portugal before moving to Firenze. And when he did, it didn't take him long to find his feet and quickly excel. And not just excel, but turn into a real team leader for them. He drove them to promotion to the Premier Liga, and then when in the Premier Liga, he was the driving force behind their fight for survival, which eventually ended in relegation. But when you look at his performances, I think it was 9 goals and 7 assists in the end for the worst, or the second worst team in the league. He really did everything he could, and that's 9 goals and 7 assists from a attacking midfield / left winger role, and a team that's up against it 90% of the games, really having to play on the break and make the most of their opportunities. He really did everything that he possibly could for them, and I think he earned his move. That move eventually to MLS, to the Vancouver Whitecaps, came, but I think, and actually I think a lot of people were kind of disappointed with that, particularly on Twitter and around Scottish football, because they expected a bigger move given his performances. I think for Gauld himself, the move made sense, but he did have interest from those bigger clubs. Two of the top 4 in Portugal, I know, made contact and were keen on his signature. There was obviously links to Southampton in the Premier League, several Championship clubs, and I know a couple of other clubs around Europe, perhaps in some smaller leagues, that were Europa League, Champions League qualifying teams, were interested in him as well and keen on his signature. I think in the end, the Vancouver deal made sense from a lifestyle perspective, which, when we talk about his move to Portugal in the first place and his sort of different mindset from your typical footballer, and his willingness or want to kind of explore and learn new things and try new things, that move to Vancouver made sense. And then also in terms of game time, as a designated player in MLS, you're going to play, and I think that was a big factor in that. Those top teams from Portugal and Southampton in the Premier League, although they were interested, he wasn't necessarily guaranteed that playing time, which I know was important to him. But he's had a very interesting career, like you say. He very much would have been someone that I think Scouted would have written about back in the day had it been around. He's one of those FM wonder kids that you always wonder if they're going to turn out as they do in the game. And I think although it's taken a while for Ryan to really develop, it's hard to argue that he's turned into a very, very good player. And like you say, to the point now where people are up in arms whenever a Scotland squad comes out and he's not in it.
Yeah, I think it must be said as well. He's still only 25 years old. He's 25 going on 26. So there's still an awful lot of his career to go, and he's already seen and done quite a lot. So I think the decision to move to Vancouver Whitecaps and to leave Sporting but remain in Portugal with Forense, that was that will have been influenced by his experience in the game, which he's coming up to sort of around about 8, 9, 10 years of the professional game. So I do admire the route that he's taken, and I think he's a player which, for anybody who hasn't watched him, I think he's a standout. He is a striking player just because of his style, and with Gauld as well. I think it's very easy to fit a narrative around his career path. Say, for example, if you were to just look at the clubs he'd played for and the times and the various loans, it'd be very easy to fit a narrative around that. Oh, well, Scottish player goes abroad or moved away too early, didn't do this, didn't do the other, didn't adapt and get amongst it with the rest of his teammates. I think it's very easy to fit that narrative without actually knowing the details. And I was very pleased to see that. I mean, it wasn't me who made the decision to host your feature on Gauld in the handbook, but I'm very, very, very glad that it is in there, because I think it's very important that those sorts of stories get told. There is another player who is over 23, but not by much, who is actually coincidentally the only player who plays abroad in the most recent Scotland squad. That's Jack Hendry, who I was amazed to find out was actually over 23. I thought he was. I mean, in my head, he must have been 23 for so long. But anyway, he this summer moved from Ostend in the Belgian Pro League to Club Brugge, who are obviously a Champions League side. He's already played against Lionel Messi, Neymar. Who else at PSG? Kylian Mbappe. Those types of players in the competition this season. Didn't get an absolute pasting either. So I think that's reflective of this being a move which has paid off. But yeah, Byron, what of Jack Hendry and sort of the rise that he's had?
Yeah, Jack Henry's a really interesting one, and I actually think there's a lot of parallels between him and Gauld, although Hendry didn't move abroad as a young player. I think in terms of what I was saying regarding playing time being a very critical factor for a player's development, Hendry is someone that really didn't play a lot of football until he was at Dundee, and by that point, I believe he was already 21 or 22. As a centre back, he had one good season at Dundee, one good half season at Dundee, and moved to Celtic. And I think this is something that gets forgotten about. I'm always keen to remind people of this because Hendry's time at Celtic wasn't a success. I think that's fair to say, and there's a lot of Celtic fans that would be a lot more critical than that. But the reality of his move is that when Rodgers signed him from Dundee, Hendry had played less than, I think it was 50 league games in his whole career. He was as a 23-year-old or so. And then he was immediately thrown into Champions League qualifiers at Parkhead in a hugely pressurized environment. And he struggled, and he wasn't an experienced player. And I think it just speaks to the importance of that experience, of having game time under your belt, and of kind of knowing your position at an elite level, and before you're able to excel at it. I think the move to Ostend, or the loan move initially, made total sense. He obviously moved to Australia before that and suffered, I think, a cruciate ligament injury that kept him out for over a year. So that one didn't quite pan out. But that move abroad to kind of get him out of the spotlight really helped Jack's development. And when you watch footage of him playing for Ostend last season, especially, we don't have to go too much into the Ostend setup and the way they're structured, but their team is always very young. He was playing in a back three alongside two 19-year-old centre backs, and he was very much the leader in that, and he excelled in that role. He was very vocal on the pitch. And not only that, he won everything that came his way too. So he was leading by example, but he was also very helpful and instructive for the young players around him. And I think because of that, he was able to recapture his confidence, and he really grew from that experience to the point now where when you watch him play, he looks very assured, very in command of his backline, and that's true when he's playing for Scotland and now for Club Brugge, like you say, a club that have shelled out, I think, in the region of €4 million for him, which isn't a ton of money, but in the context of Scottish football, that's a fair sum. And I think a lot of Celtic fans were surprised that a club like Club Brugge were interested in him, a Champions League club. I'm sure they'd heard about how well he had done at Ostend. I believe they had the the second best defensive record in the league in the regular season. Anyway, we'll call it the regular season because I don't want to get into the muddy waters of the Belgian playoff system. But
Oh, honestly, please, let's not. It's so complex. I remember sort of researching it for a podcast last year, and that is it's far too complex for my liking. It's only trumped by Serie B's playoff system,
yeah,
which is it's mind-boggling. Anyway, sorry to ruin your train of thought.
no, I just would also say have a look at the Erskedivisi's playoff system as well, because that's broken down into quarters or something like that, and the winner of each. Anyway, have a look in your own time, but it's a disaster. Yeah, so they had a very good season. He was the commander of their back line. He led the league in aerial duels, his passing, which has always been a key part of his game, and his ability on the ball, which is something that brought him to Celtic in the first place. I think it's what attracted Brendan Rodgers to him. Is still there. He's still very comfortable on the ball, but he's just really developed exactly as you would have hoped he would have at Celtic. He was able to do that at Ostend, and now having made that move to Club Brugge, again a big club like Celtic, playing in the Champions League, high pressure environment, he's excelled early. It's obviously super early. He's only played, I think, 4 games at the moment, but one of those coming against PSG, in which they got a 1-1 draw, which is a huge result. Another one coming against RB Leipzig, in which they took home all 3 points in an away game. Managed to not quite keep Christopher Nkunku quiet. He did score, but keep that RB Leipzig front line quiet, which is a very talented group of players. So he's done very well, and I think he deserves credit for not only coming back from the scrutiny and the bad time he had at Celtic, but also coming back from a cruciate ligament injury to now playing for Scotland. I think most people would agree that he was probably man of the match in our 1-0 win over Austria. To come back, not just come back, but to come back to such a high standard and to be at such a high level is really impressive. And I think at 26, he's only just got there, really. But like I say, and like the point I made about Gauld and the point I made about Hendry at the beginning, sometimes players develop at different rates, and if there's talent there, you have to really give it a chance to develop, and rather than just write them off immediately because they didn't work out at one club in one system under one manager. Players excel in different environments, and I think Henry's a prime example of that.
Sometimes it can take, I mean, it's something we say on this podcast so often, that, player development is not linear. And the fact that minutes that will be given by certain managers will then be stripped away by others because of the situations that are befalling certain clubs. It's a lot easier to give minutes to a up and coming youth prospect at a club where the expectation is minimal, as opposed to a club with the stature of Celtic, where the expectation is enormous, of course, in sort of over the past decade or so. So I do know what you're saying there with Jack Hendry, but now it's time for the honourable mentions list, and I listed down a few because I thought it would be impossible to get through all of them, but I did just want to. I mean, it's the nature of an honourable mentions section, isn't it? I didn't want to say that I'd forgotten all about them or they hadn't made the cut. So there's the likes of Fraser Hornby, who's at Stade Rennes in France in Ligue 1, Jordan Holsgrove, who I believe is at Celta Vigo's B team, Liam Henderson in Serie A, as well as Aaron Hickey, Harvey St Clair, Lawrence Shankland, who's followed Jack Hendry's lead and gone over to Belgium with Beerschot, Lewis Morgan, who is in MLS alongside Ryan Gauld. But I'm led to believe, Byron, that you've actually got quite a few others and a few more honourable mentions to name drop.
Yeah, so the guys you mentioned there are obviously worth talking about. Liam Henderson in particular, I think he's had a good start to life in it with Empoli in Serie A, so hopefully he can continue performing there. He's a really interesting player to talk about. I think from a Scotland perspective, he's developed into the type of midfielder we don't normally see. He's a bit of a Mitzala, a number 8 that plays wide and can cross the ball well, and he's a really interesting profile of footballer that if he keeps developing or keeps playing well for Empoli up until sort of Christmas or for the next 6 months, I think there will be calls, will be serious calls, and there should probably be serious we should probably take a serious look at him perhaps being called up to the Scotland squad. But yeah, there's a bunch of interesting players. I think the ones you mentioned there, Fraser Hornby is another one that it's a big season for him. I think obviously just had a loan stint at Aberdeen that I think it's fair to say it didn't quite work out well, but I also think it would be fair to say that Aberdeen fans would probably acknowledge that it wasn't the best environment for a player to come into on loan. But yeah, as you mentioned, I've got a couple of other players that are probably more suitable for a scouted podcast and probably more a little bit more interesting, a little bit more unknown players that are a bit more in the Ewan Urain mold, shall we say. So the first one I would mention is Thomas Kirkpatrick. He's a 17-year-old left back. You'll be surprised to hear, Joe.
No, I'm not.
At NEC Nijmegen in the Eredivisie. So he's actually a Dutch under-17 international as well, but he's also played and trained with Scotland at under-16 level. So he's eligible. I was
going to say, with that surname, he's not playing for anybody else apart from Scotland. But wow, that's quite a surprise. Caught me off guard.
Yeah, so I mean, he's a fairly unknown one, and I believe he's only trained with the under-16s for Scotland. I said he played there, but I believe he's only been invited to train. But he is eligible. He's playing for Nijmegen's 18s. They're a good youth setup. I mean, he's coming through a Dutch academy, which is always just exciting anyway. But he's worth keeping an eye on in the future, I think. Another one's William Sandford. He's a 19-year-old defensive midfielder at Gothenburg in Sweden. He is Swedish-born, has a Scottish father. He's been on trial at Rangers before. He's been on trial at St Johnstone. He hasn't actually played at international level for anyone, but he's an interesting prospect. The academy at Gothenburg is very, very good. And like I say, I know he's very proud of his sort of Scottish connections. I think he's someone that would hope one day to perhaps play in Scotland. I know he's keen to play in the UK, so he's one to look out for. And then three more that I'll quickly mention. Jackson Conway, a 19-year-old striker with Atlanta United, actually born in Leeds, Joe, but through his granddad who played for Celtic, I believe Jim Conway, I don't want to get his name wrong, but I believe it was Jim Conway. Through his granddad, he's eligible for Scotland. He's actually played 7 games for Atlanta so far this season, 233 minutes, scored a goal. He's a really interesting prospect. He's obviously eligible for Scotland, for England, for the US, but it's kind of, as I was saying at the beginning, with Scotland being such a small country, I think these players are always worth exploring for us. And then 2 more, Frank Ross with Go Ahead Eagles in the Eredivisie. He was a youth player at Aberdeen who they had quite high hopes for, I believe. He's ended up moving to the Eredivisie with Go Ahead Eagles, and they got promoted last season. He's unfortunately out with a cruciate ligament injury. But he should return, I think, in the next month or so. So he's a good one to look out for. I mean, if you're looking to watch some Dutch football, then definitely tune in to Go Ahead Eagles, and you can at least have someone to root for there. And then the last one I'll say is Andy Irving is the third Scot in Munich this season. He's at Türkgücü München in the Dritte Liga, 21-year-old who also came from Hearts. Still young, still developing. Hearts had high hopes for him, and he's ended up taking the bold step to move to Munich with Türkgücü. He started his career there really quite well. He's broken into the first team quite regularly. So someone worth watching as well.
Well, there's your list of names for future Scottish internationals, perhaps. No, I mean, it's always exciting to see how these players pan out and how their development continues. And yeah, there's a nice spread of countries there, a nice spread of clubs, a nice spread of dual nationals as well. So yeah, I think that just about wraps things up for us on this week's episode of the Scouted Football Podcast. Thank you very much to Byron for his expertise. I think that's still not doing it justice at the moment, but for your knowledge on all things Scots abroad. For people who would like to read stuff that you've written or would like to follow you, where can they find you on social media?
Yeah, so it's just my name, Byron Hutchison, which I guess isn't the easiest, but yeah, it's Byron Hutchison on Twitter, also on Instagram if you fancy seeing some behind the scenes from Bundesliga things now and again. You can follow me there, and then also footballfromafar.com if you fancy reading some longer form pieces about the players abroad and some analysis.
Certainly. Right, well, that's all from us on the Scouted Football Podcast this week. I've been Joe Donoghue. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please consider leaving us a review if you've enjoyed this episode or any of the previous 83. But yeah, this has been the Scouted Football Podcast. Stay safe, take care. Bye for now.